I'd now like to introduce a member, Julian Lewis, Right Honourable Julian Lewis MP for New Forest East, who is chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, but is speaking today as twice chairing the House of Commons Defence Committee from 2015 to 2019. Where they actually produced 30 inquiry reports, I gather, incredibly busy and productive, and has done a lot to argue the case for Trident, renewal of Trident, nuclear submarines, and indeed to restore the defence budget from 2% to closer to 3%. So thank you for your advocacy on that, Julian. He recently won the election to the Intelligence Security Committee, but lost the whip. I'm sorry to hear that, but I do hope he will be rejoining the Conservative Party very quickly. But he's an excellent chair in both cases, but is talking more from the Defence Committee point of view tonight. So Julian, please give us a few words, if you would.
Well, David, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Update, and that is that I'm pleased to say that the whip was restored to me unconditionally, just in time for me to be able to vote for the departure from the European Union on the basis of the deal on the 30th of December. And it was very nice to be able to do that. And Boris Johnson pointed out that not one of the 28 Spartans, of whom I'm proud to call myself one, who had resisted the Brexit in name only deal that had been offered by his predecessor 3 times, but not one of them voted against our final departure deal. And it was nice to do that back in the Conservative fold.
Right.
So it's a bit frightening when I realize that my initial contact with the Freedom Association goes back over 40 years to 1977, when I made contact with Norris McWhirter, one of the founders of the association, because of our shared concern about what was happening to the Labour Party, which at the time was being infiltrated by an organization that was really the Revolutionary Socialist League, a Trotskyist organization, but was known as the Militant Tendency. And although the campaign we waged, which involved a number of court actions and battles within Labour, local Labour parties that were subject to this form of infiltration and subversion, were deemed at the time to be meant to destabilize Labour, nothing could be further from the truth, because in a successful and safe democracy, you need not only a governing party that is committed, for example, to strong defense, you need a responsible opposition that shares that commitment. And really, if there's any theme to what I've been trying to do both before entering Parliament and since, it's been trying to work across party lines with those people who believe in a strong defense for this country. And in that connection, I can only salute not only Captain Tom, who we're all sad to learn of his passing today, but also people like Richard and Tim, who put themselves in the front line of the armed forces to help protect our country. And of course, when they did that originally, they could not know, and this is relevant to the point I want to get across, they could not know what they were letting themselves in for. They were joining the armed forces in the knowledge that crises arise, but more often than not, the crises which do arise are not predicted significantly in advance, or even sometimes at all. And that has implications for the sort of defense forces you want to have and the sort of investment in defense that you are prepared to make. Let me give you a current analogy. And that is, of course, the disaster of this COVID pandemic. Let's assume that in a matter of months, we will be out of the worst of it. It will have retreated in the way that the terrible influenza pandemic, which killed more people at the end of the First World War than had died in the First World War itself, did. And if somebody then proposes that we should invest very large sums of money when there is no imminent prospect of a pandemic in such things as PPE or the ability to manufacture future vaccines on a large scale, I think there will be little resistance to any such suggestion. It is as a result of the terrible experience that we've had that people will have learned a hard lesson that if you want to be safe in the future, you've got to invest in the infrastructure to protect yourself in the present. And the same is true of the armed forces, and the same is true of the unpredictability of the threats that we will face. So, for example, when the Cold War came to an end, there was a tendency after the peace dividend reductions had been implemented, there was a tendency to think that the days of state versus state confrontation had come to an end. And then after 9/11, that tendency was reinforced by the idea that the primary threats that we had to be aware of were international terrorism. And so you had a strange splitting up of the threats of the Cold War, which had seen a combination of a very powerful state with a lot of hard power, namely the Soviet Union, but which also had a pervasive ideology, the ideology of communism, that actually reached out into some of the target societies and attracted sympathizers there, Marxists and fellow travelers, whom the Freedom Association did a lot to shine a spotlight on in the 1970s and 80s. And it reached out to them in the hope of rotting these free societies from within. So you had that lethal combination of a lot of hard power and a pervasive subversive ideology. And that has subsequently split because we ended up finding ourselves in more recent decades facing a pervasive ideology, which is Islamist extremism, but without a great deal of hard power behind it. And on the other hand, we've seen the reemergence of threats from countries like Russia again, sadly, with a lot of hard power, but without an ideology now that appeals to a potential fifth column in the countries that they're targeting. You could argue perhaps that China combines both, but I don't think that the ideology of Chinese communism has the same appeal in Western societies that Soviet communism did. I don't detect that in any way, shape, or form. On the contrary, the part of Chinese society that has an appeal in our societies and is a danger is the economic appeal of having tremendous investment and goods manufactured very cheaply and in questionable ways and by even more questionable methods. So what I'm trying to get at is, and this was very much the case with the work of the Defence Select Committee during the period that I chaired it, if you come to an acceptance of the fact that no matter how cleverly you try to predict the future, it is almost always going to take you by surprise, you have to have versatility in your armed forces, you have to have flexibility, and you have to have the potential to reach across a wide divide of potential threats, any one of which could happen, but you cannot know which one is going to happen until you're actually facing it. And that is why we waged this campaign about defense expenditure. And I'll just sum up what the situation was in historical terms very briefly, because we got the House of Commons analysts onto the job, and we got them to plot what had happened in major areas of expenditure over recent decades. And what they found was this. In 1963, we were spending similar sums, about 6% of GDP, on welfare and benefits and on defense. By the time we got to 2017, we were spending 6 times on welfare and benefits what we spent on defense. More recently, in the mid-1980s, we spent similar sums, about 5% of GDP, on education, on health, and on defense. But by the time we were looking at these figures in the period 2017-2018, we were spending 2.5 times as much on education as on defense, and nearly 4 times as much on health as we spend on defense. And if I can show you visually, even through the screen, it's quite clear what was happening to defense expenditure in rapid decline over the years. And this is the expenditure on the National Health Service going in the opposite direction. Now, people say that in looking at the threats that we face in the future, we must recognize that there is a whole new battlefield called the gray zone, consisting of 21st century threats in cyberspace, which are waged at a level that do not cross the threshold that would trigger an armed response by conventional weapons, but nevertheless could bring society to its knees. I accept that that is true. What I do not accept is that in preparing to meet those new threats, it means we must denude the conventional armed forces of their hard power, which is necessary to deter and occasionally to meet the more traditional threats, because the new threats that we face today are additional to, they are not substitute for, the more traditional threats we faced in the past. So to allow time for questions, I'll just sum up like this. I'll say basically, as long as we continue to possess a strategic nuclear deterrent on continuous at-sea patrolling, we can be pretty confident that we will not be subjected to nuclear blackmail or attack. As long as we retain our alliance with the world's largest military power, namely the United States of America, through NATO, we are fairly likely not to be subject to conventional attack. However, there is a danger, and I'm sure this will come up in the questioning, so I'll finish with this point. There is a danger that as a result of the European Union's wish to be an actor in its own right in the defense field, they could undertake commitments to defend other countries that are not automatically covered by the Article 5 American guarantee, which is what keeps NATO countries safe. And the danger could be that we could be drawn by a process of action and reaction unintentionally into a confrontation on behalf of a third-party commitment that had been undertaken by the European Union. And the European Union, whatever they do in defense and whatever we might choose to do to help them, would not be strong enough by itself to deter. That is why, without the involvement of America, NATO would be like Hamlet without the prince. And that, unfortunately, is the sort of structure that the EU wants to construct as part of its super state building project. I would just say, by way of reassurance, do have a look sometime at the government's response in 2018 to the report that we did as the Defence Committee, where we posed a series of questions on the government's plans for a future security partnership with the European Union. The document is called HC 1570, HC House of Commons 1570, and it certainly is full of assurances saying that we can confirm that it's the government's intention to participate in CSDP operations and missions on a case-by-case basis, and only after a decision has been taken autonomously by the United Kingdom to do so. This will be useful ammunition in the future if they ever try to say that we are obliged to go into situations that we would not, in our own interests, choose to involve ourselves with. Thank you.